U.S. Constitution. It's an amazing moment. In all of human history, there are few times when so many people come together for such a noble purpose. The purpose of the Constitution, in the writing of it, was to take this newly formed government, this newly formed country that really had very little government. Because before the Constitution, they were loosely held together by the Articles of Confederation. They needed this Constitution to give the central government some power so that it would be able to last, so it could be able to survive. So they had to come together, and the power of it is that first they were concerned about liberty. The government had to preserve, above all else, the liberty of Americans. And second, it had to be able to be strong enough to withstand the outside forces that were sure to be attacking the country. So how do you get all these different people with different opinions? You had people in the North with an industrial base. You had people in the South with an agricultural base. You had the slave owners of the South and the anti-slave forces in the North. You had tremendous forces coming against each other, and to bring them all into one country was a staggering feat. And it had to be done by embracing conflict. It really had to be done by embracing the idea that we're not always going to agree. We have to be able to compromise. We have diversity of thought, therefore we must have compromise in order to function. That was really one of the key thoughts of Federalist Number 10. If you were to sum up all of Federalist Number 10 in 2 words, it could be diversity and conflict. This was a government that would encourage disagreement. In fact, you could view the Constitution as an agreement to disagree. The underpinning of the entire document is this agreement that we will always have different opinions. Factions will arise. We may consider factions dangerous, but as long as we recognize and embrace our diversity of thought, we're going to be able to get through it, have meaningful discussions, and come to compromise in which everyone can function within one country. The problem was, in France, it was a very different picture. Dunn states it well. She says, in France, however, the momentum was toward order, not tumult, toward oneness, not multiplicity. Far from accepting diversity and conflict, the French worshipped homogeneity and unanimity. The French saw the 3 estates becoming one. They saw all mankind, at least within France, becoming one, being of a single mind, this general will. They had no tolerance for diversity of thought. There was only one general good that was good for everyone. And therefore, they couldn't accept the idea of people having differences of opinion and working through them and compromising as part of your regular political life. To Madison and the framers, the idea of getting rid of differences between people was absurd. Everyone would have some differences of opinion based on age, where they were raised, geography, social status, economic status, and 1,000 other factors. People were simply never going to all agree. When you're talking about politics, when you're talking about the political life of the country, everybody has a different thing that they are interested in that supports them or the people that they care about or the ideas that they care about. Madison says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. Now, this seems self-evident. As long as people exist and they're free to think and they're free to express themselves, there will be differences of opinion. And he says this, and I think this is beautiful. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. But could it be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air? In other words, fire is a danger. In order to get rid of fire, would you be willing to remove all oxygen? Well, then everyone dies. And he says, ultimately, that's what you're talking about. If you're talking about removing all faction from your political life, you are removing all liberty. Liberty of thought is critical to the American experience. And what he's saying is if you create unanimity at the expense of liberty, then you have no political life at all. You're as good as dead. Can total liberty and total equality coexist? Is there tension between these two things? Liberty and equality. In order to have one, must you sacrifice the other? There is a place where every person has the same amount of work hours for which they receive the same pay. They have the same amount and type of food. They have the same accommodations. They even wear the same clothes. They get the same exercise. They get the same medical care. It is perfect equality. That place is called prison. Now think about that. If you want total equality, then you will sacrifice liberty. Liberty cannot exist where the primary concern is for total equality, at least in terms of equality of outcome. Now, we can have equality of opportunity. That's a very different thing. Equality of outcome requires that essentially no one succeeds. No one tries hard. Everyone has to be mediocre, or maybe a little less than mediocre, because after all, some aren't capable of rising. See what I'm saying? You're going to have a situation where liberty is completely sacrificed to this ideal of equality, and equality really isn't even a true thing in that sense. Let's go back to the analogy of prison. In prison, if we are to believe what we see in movies and television and from the accounts of people who have been there, I fortunately have not, but what we understand is that within the prison organization, there are still people that rise to positions of power within the cellmates, and there are still people who become relegated to an inferior status. So even there, in the most controlled and unfree environments you can think of, you still have human will exerting itself. There's no escaping it. The more you try to create a false sense of equality, the more you will create a lack of liberty. Manuel Sias says, what is the third estate? Everything. What has it been in the political order up to now? Nothing. What is it asking for? To become something. Sias is talking about the condition in France prior to the revolution. The three estates, which were completely unequal. Now, here's where you have that difference that I was talking about. There is a gross difference in opportunity. If you were born to the lower classes, you could not suddenly become a noble. You might be able to join the clergy, but even the clergy in France at that time had its own social structure, and the higher persons in the clergy usually came from noble families. So essentially, if you were born into a low status, you had no opportunity to rise above that. You could maybe make yourself wealthy if you were so concerned and so willing to sacrifice and work hard and take risks. You might be able to become even wealthy. There were wealthy bourgeoisie. These were the merchants of the time, many of whom came from very, very humble beginnings. And through sheer force of will and daring do, they were able to make themselves wealthy. Okay, but they still couldn't make themselves noble. They still had to pay taxes. They still lacked the basic opportunities that were granted to the nobility. I assume that's the origins for the difference in the way the two sides looked at things. The Americans came from a point of view in which there was no nobility. Nobility was a thing to be scorned, a thing to be shunned. The people were equal in the truest sense of the word right from the beginning. And when they decided to choose their first president, they didn't choose someone who had a noble lineage. Washington actually came from a fairly humble background. He married into some wealth, but he actually came from a very humble background. It was not a noble class. There was no noble class. Benjamin Franklin, the most famous American of the period, was not nobility in any sense of the word. He liked to show his lack of nobility by running around in a coonskin cap when he was in Europe. And it was a demonstration of the egalitarianism of the American experiment. So that was the background from which the Americans wrote their Constitution, in which they said, everybody's equal, everybody has a voice, everybody is important, everybody has an opportunity. And we recognize right from the start that some will take that opportunity and run with it this way, and others will run a different direction, and some won't run at all. But everyone gets an opportunity. That's America. In France, they started with a situation where there was no opportunity. If you were not born in the noble class, you were condemned, as it were, to a sort of social slavery. You were condemned to a status which would never allow you to rise above where you were in any meaningful way. You might be able to gain some wealth, but you're never going to be anything other than the third estate, the commoners. And so from that point of view, they decided to create a unity, which the Americans already had to begin with, a unity, but in their mind, in order to create unity, it had to be absolute equality. It had to be a single mindset. Everybody had to be on the same page. Everybody had to think the same way. As Madison so beautifully articulated, that's just not possible. Where you have human beings, you will have difference of opinion. And of course, as we see in what happened in the revolutionary experiment in France, there were some differences of opinion, and heads rolled, literally.